Record. All right. So everyone can see my screen, okay?
Yep.
And let me just share this screen here. Alrighty. Okay, so just to double check before I get going, can everyone see the big screen? You can't see anything from PowerPoint. Yep, okay. Alrighty, so here we go. Right screen, wrong screen before I move on. Charlotte, all good? Yeah? Okay, cool. So this is a short, I'm going to try and keep it short because we don't have that much time, but how to create a successful startup podcast in a step-by-step guide. And it's so much to cram into 40 minutes, but I will do my best. So who are we? Just to give you a bit of background, my name's Tiffany Hart and I am the co-host of Go Getters, the Future Skills podcast for smart women in business. And I started this podcast, as Charlotte said, with my co-founder or my co-host or my pod wife, we call each other, Tanya Gama, in January 2020. But actually it took quite a bit of time to prepare this podcast. So to give you a bit of a background, I am a startup founder, started a couple of companies. I'm now working in digital transformation. I work as a consultant. I work as a pitch coach for startups. And I do this podcast a lot. A lot of my time goes into this podcast also. We are building up this podcast and yeah, we've been working on this now since January 2019. So to move on, I just mentioned Go Getters is the podcast where we started. And it's really focused on women and it's focused on women in business. And we started this in January 2020, but it did take a lot of time to get there. To get to a podcast, there's so many things that you might be considering, you know, what kind of podcast should I put on? Where should I host it? Should it be written? Should it be scripted? Should it be ad hoc? Should it be Adlib? You know, what kind of equipment do I need? How do I do my artwork? How do I host my podcast? All of these questions can take a while to be able to figure out those things. So it took us about a year to really research every aspect because we wanted to do a good podcast. You know, there's nothing worse than launching a podcast that sounds shit. And the biggest thing about that is, you know, finding the right microphone. Of course, you can get started with a okay microphone, but we just tried to find, you know, where we wanted to be. We looked at other competitor podcasts. We also looked at some podcasts that we really admired and we could see ourselves kind of fitting into that space in some time. And we tried to replicate that sound or that same feeling, if that makes sense. So yeah, so it does take a while, but hopefully with this meetup and also other times that you can connect with other blogs or on other podcasts, you can learn about this and can really scale up creating a podcast. So why podcasting actually is the radio of the modern era. I'm going to talk about America for now, but you know, let's consider the world. 44% of Americans actually have listened to at least one podcast, which is 1 in 3 Americans, which is huge. And under 55s are listening to podcasts monthly. I'm sure all of you have listened to a podcast. That's why you're interested in creating a podcast. And you know, if you look at that, that's an audience of 124 million people in the US alone. So it's a huge audience. And if you scale that across the world, wherever you're targeting, if it's German language, if it's English language, or if it's whatever language, you know, you can really see that there is a sizable audience in podcasting. In fact, the average weekly listener now consumes over 6.5 hours of podcasting a week. I know I do. I'm not sure if you do too, but I'm sure you do a lot of podcasting and listening to podcasting, especially in this time of COVID. Podcasting has gone up and listening has gone up. So it's actually quite an interesting time to really formulate your ideas and see what can come from this time and use this creative time to create something. If it's in the form of a podcast, awesome. So why are podcasts on the rise? Do you have any ideas? You want to put them in the chat? why they're on the rise? Let's see if I can see any chat. Here we are. So let's have a look. Yep, they're easy to consume. Yep, definitely Corona. Lotus says they're from Corona. Yeah, we're all sitting at home. I haven't left the house today because you hear them from everywhere. Yes, definitely. Because they can be consumed on the go. Yes, Samira, absolutely. Nora says you can filter for content you want. Clara says no visuals. You're missing by just listening. You can consume it anywhere. You can consume it in the kitchen, cooking. You can consume it while doing sport, going for a walk, whatever. Frank says they're easily accessible. He loves listening to them when doing a run, which is also a great time to learn. Esther says listening to someone brings us the feeling to not be alone. I completely agree. Listening to other voices you really enjoy, listening to can really bring a sense of community. Actually, you're part of a community, and I definitely feel a part of community on multiple podcasts. So that's super important. Thanks for that point. Dale says the ambience whilst working from home. Yes, it's nice to listen to someone in the background. And Marina says passive learning. Thank you so much for all that feedback. That's awesome. And I completely agree with you. All those things are totally true why podcasting is awesome. So a quick focus on both sides, and I think you covered it very, very well from a listener's perspective. Podcasts speak directly to the niche and interests. You know, it kind of speaks to a certain kind of interest group and a niche. It's an immersive format. You know, most of the time it feels like speaking to the host. It feels like you're speaking to the person that you're listening to. And over time, if you listen to their content weekly or monthly, you feel like you get a relationship with that person, and it's actually quite a nice thing. On the flip side, from an advertiser's perspective, which is the other side of podcasting, which a lot of podcasts do get into, it's not necessary, but to find sponsors and partners for your podcast is a great way to monetize your content. So it's really an amazing way to find highly focused topics. You know, because, you know, audience normally segment themselves. If you're interested in specifically a podcast about pets, you know, you're going to do a podcast about cats. You're going to do a podcast about specific cat types. You're going to do a podcast about whatever in that niche. So podcasts actually do segment themselves, and it's quite a unique form of marketing. If you don't segment yourself, then actually you can get lost in the rest of podcasts in podcast land, because there's actually quite a lot. So niching is a very important thing, and advertisers have taken that seriously. So it has been seen that ad revenue is expected to double to 650 million by 2020. So that's a lot of money, and it's just for podcasting. We're not talking about any other content platform or content medium. So how the heck do you get started? That's the question I'm sure you're all asking, and I'm sure you're wondering. There's a lot of ways to get started. There's a lot of different approaches, but with this, here are the basics, and hopefully this builds a bit of a foundation for you to continue researching and continue learning and continue finding information for yourself. So key areas to consider. So let's talk about the individual versus the co-host. Let's talk about the scripted versus the unscripted. Let's talk about the niche and topic, which I just mentioned. Let's talk about interviewing and getting interviews, or just going solo. Let's talk about equipment, recording, post-production, and your final launch. Exactly. So let's talk about the individual versus the co-host. So there are lots of things when it comes to creating a podcast. And of course, you start off with, what are you going to talk about? What do you want to talk about? I'm sure you have a bit of an idea in the back of your mind. But do you need someone to help you? Do you want to do this with somebody? Do you want to go down the path with creating a podcast together with someone? Of course, it's very normal and natural to create a podcast by yourself. There are millions of examples of individual podcasts. There are also great examples of co-hosts or co-host podcasts. Things to think about if you are considering co-hosting. Is your co-host equally committed? That's the most important thing I have to say, because it's a heck of a lot of work. And if you want to do something, it's anything, a startup, a YouTube channel, any project, is the person you're doing it with equally committed? Because there's nothing worse than doing something and you're doing half and the other person's not doing. So you have to compensate for their underdoing. Don't let chemistry make you lazy. So, of course you start a podcast with, a good colleague or a good friend, and then sometimes you can get stuck on a conversation and just chit chat and you forget actually the audience is there. So really make sure that you are there to give value to your audience and share information, because at the end of the day, you're there for your audience. It does create less work. I have to say, working with Tanya, she is a best friend, but she's also my pod wife and also my work wife. I work together with her in the company, and it does create less work. You know each other's strengths. You know what you each have individual areas of expertise, and you can actually kind of share the load. It is a lot of work doing a podcast. If you're doing it weekly, it's a heck of a lot of work. If you're doing it monthly, quarterly, it can create less work. It's depending on how much time you have for a podcast. A variety of voices does make it easier listening. I'm sure you've heard that before. Listening to a podcast with an interviewee is easier to listen to because you've got a bit of a back and forth chit chat banter going on. And it does, as I mentioned, share the load. So knowing who's going to upload the show notes, who's going to do the editing and post-production, who's going to do the hustling on your socials, who's going to do XYZ. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of jobs, but it's not putting you off here. It's an amazing, exciting, one of the best things that I've done, creating a podcast, but it does share the load. So do consider having a co-host. If you do want to have a co-host, find someone you really genuinely like. Find someone you're happy to sit across the table and talk with, and that you actually can work together. Some great things actually coming from radio is actually using hand signals, so you can actually easily communicate and get the conversation flowing. So stop, I'm finishing my point, okay, go. You can use hand signals to kind of get the conversation flowing in a better way. Let me just close this down for 1 second. So those are my notes I can mention to you here, and divide up the post-production. I just mentioned that, and your number one goal with having a co-host, and also having a co-host, is actually to make your co-host sound amazing. Listeners love to listen to podcasts that actually where people generally respect and like each other. So everyone needs to make important points and everyone needs to have the last laugh. So it's important to make each other sound good. And also with yourself, it's important to make sure you balance the way you speak and also how you present yourself. And you need to find a good pod buddy. Those are my points. Scripted versus unscripted. So scripted means you write and read the script verbatim with your podcast. Adlib means you speak freely without restriction or direction, or an outline basically is having a basic list of content that you want to share. When it comes to scripted, it's really about perfection. You want to have the highest accuracy. You might not be comfortable with speaking on the microphone, so scripted might be a good way to go. I can definitely say that Tanya and I started with scripted because we were absolutely freaking out about, will we miss this point? Will we miss that point? Will we screw it up? Recording a podcast is awesome in audio. And sometimes if you're doing a live video, you can't edit it. So with scripting, it's a great thing to start off with. Famous news broadcasts on radio and TV are definitely scripted. Political speakers are scripted. Commercials are almost always scripted. Even late night comedy is partially scripted. So scripting ensures that you get your message exactly right. But you need to work really hard not to sound robotic. It's a very important thing. It can take professional coaching or years of practice to get really good at reading a script. Also with podcasting, you can also just continue going over the line again and again to make it sound more natural and more relaxed. So if you do go with scripted, you can just keep repeating and just make sure when you do edit, you can see where your next part has gone. So you've gone through multiple lines to feel or to create the most natural sounding line. On the total opposite to scripting is ad-libbing. So when you speak freely, you have no restrictions or direction for your content. This can be very comfortable for some people to present, but others can be very uncomfortable when publishing something unpolished. That's definitely my case. I like to be a bit more polished. I like to be a bit more clear, because for the subject matter we're talking about, which is business, marketing, tech, we want to have things really clear, really on point. So that's from my perspective. Ad-libbing allows you to personally put your personality in and really fully show who you are, as long as you're sharing something or presenting something you care about. So a really nice approach is the outline, and it's called the hybrid approach, which is kind of between your rigid script and your ad-lib. It's when you have your points that you want to cover, and they're extra handy, and then you present from those points. It doesn't mean you need to have a list of like the 10 ways to, or how to in 5 steps, but you might want to have, really clear points, long sentences about what you want to talk about, and then you can talk around that topic or around that sentence if you feel comfortable enough. Yeah, so it's a great way to do so. We are now at a point where we're in between scripted and outline. So just so you know, from our perspective, we've moved from pure script to outline in the last 4 months, or actually last year and 4 months. But for this, we can kind of feel more comfortable around a topic. And when it comes to really descriptive things, we stick to the script. Niche topic. So it's a really important thing with podcasting, as I mentioned at the start, to really nail a niche. It's your long tail, basically. It's how you get found on the various podcasting platforms, from Google Podcasts to Spotify to Apple Podcasts, or to wherever you get your podcasts. It's a really important thing to find that niche. So you can niche down via topic. Get specific about what you want to talk about, and or where, why, when, to really even create more of a niche. Niching really scares the crap out of podcasters, that's for sure, because people are afraid of creating a smaller audience, and they think they'll have a smaller success by creating a smaller audience. Have you thought about that before? I certainly have. Or maybe it's one thing, people with big ambitions that want to be pod stars and have millions and millions of followers think, okay, I can't create a podcast with, such a niche. What's really important is actually to gain an audience and to get people that are really dedicated to your topic. So the most important thing is to really hyper focus on your niche and become that authority in that space and be really specific. You can also niche down in target audience. So another way of niching is to really find a smaller group within a smaller group. So obvious ways you can niche down is via demographics. So age, gender, ethnicity, location, marital status, if that's interesting for you. And you can also niche down via psychographics like religion, beliefs, desires. There are so many ways to niche. So find the way that's best for you and really hone and go for it. But the second thing for us to consider is, can you niche too far? And yes, you can. It's possible to niche too far. But here are a few ways to quickly check if you have niched too far. Can you come up with 50 episode topics? Can you write down 50 lines, 50 different topic lines within a short period of time around that niche you're talking about? If you can, you're fine. But if you can't, you might want to niche up a bit. You research a new topic or sub-avatar group where there are just not enough people to qualify. That's something else to think about if it's too far niched. It's really important to really find the right balance, and you might need to niche right down and then broaden, or you might be broad and then you niche further. But better to start with a clear niche and a focus when you get going with your podcast. Interviews for solo. So to give you a bit of background, Tanya and I started this podcast and we're both mums. I've got a son who's just about to turn 2. She's got 2 kids, one who's only 3 months and one who's nearly 5. So we thought about, how are we going to interview people? It's quite challenging back pre-COVID times to actually get in front of people and create interviews and interview people. So how the heck are we going to do this? So we thought, okay, we're going to create a podcast which is more topically based, and we're going to create podcast or content from ourselves and then add in the ad hoc interview so we can actually create more value for our audience, and also in bringing on interviewees actually helps you to scale if they've got really good followers themselves, if they're an influencer themselves, or if they have something really great to talk about, which is awesome for your audience and can really add value to your audience. So interviews or creating interviews with people is a great thing to do, but you need to look at how much time you have and how you can do it yourself. If you travel often, if you have lots of meetings, it can actually be a great thing to do a podcast which has frequent interviewees. But also look in your niche area. Do your competitors also have lots of interviewees? Maybe you could diversify and have more content from yourself, or have equal content to equal interviewees, if that makes sense. So great ways to find interviewees or to look and how to create better interviews is to create an interesting interviews list, a guest list. Who would be your top people? Who would be the top people you'd love to contact and like to talk to? Create a list. Maybe it's 5 people, maybe it's 10 people, maybe it's 100 people. However big, think broad, think grand, and come up with a list of interesting people you want to talk to. Do some background research. So if someone actually does accept your interview, do a bit of background research in the subject area of that person. There's nothing worse than getting into an interview and you don't really know much about what that person does or what their subject area is. Get to know your interviewees' work specifically. So when you introduce them, it's good to know really the background of their work. You can look at their LinkedIn profiles. You can do a bit of Googling on them. You can check them out if they've got any YouTube videos. You can look at their website. There's great ways to really suss out a person's work. Write your guest's bio. That's super important. I can say I actually interviewed Charlotte, who's the host here of this meetup today, on our podcast nearly a month and a half or 2 months ago. And I wrote Charlotte's bio to make sure I really understood who Charlotte was. I understood what she was into. I quickly did an interview with her before I did the podcast and before I recorded the bio, so I could really get to feel, okay, is this your background? I read this on LinkedIn, but is this what you did? These are the companies you worked for? Are these your strengths? Is this what you're focusing on? Is that what you want for your business? So you get a bit of a feel for them and you know who they are tangibly. Really determine whether your interview fits your audience. I know some people can be amazing to interview, but do they really fit for your audience? That's the question. I have thought about some awesome people to interview for Grow Getters, but they do not fit for Grow Getters and they will never fit for Grow Getters. So really make sure you find out who is your audience and fit those people for your audience. Prepare questions in advance. That's a great thing to do. That keeps the conversation flowing. You know the flow of questions, and questions can also link to each other. So block your questions in kind of sequential order, so they actually flow and you get a good conversation going. But make sure you're free, and you can also ask questions in between. So if there's something else that comes up that's interesting, ask it. You can always edit it. You can always cut out the ums and ahs. You can always cut out the parts which didn't make sense, or you asked the wrong question, it went the wrong way. You can always edit it. So prepare your questions, but feel free to ad-lib and ad hoc question your interviewee and let them talk. It's really important to let the person talk. I know you're used to, if you are developing or you have a podcast, you're used to talking, or you're looking to create a podcast, it's important to listen. And that's really what an interview is all about. Listening to the person, understanding the story, and extracting from them what's really good and what's really valuable to share from their background and what's important for your audience. So moving into the nitty-gritty, this is the kind of background or prep work that you do for your podcast. If you have a podcast already, or if you're looking to create a podcast, hopefully that helps you to build a bit of a foundation and questions to think about for launching your podcast. So when you start a podcast, what do you do? What do you buy? Where do you go? What? How about microphone? Start with a microphone. Microphone is always the best. So mic recommendations. There are 2 different forms of microphones you can use. If you are doing a multiple person podcast, I'd really recommend doing or buying a condenser microphone. Condenser mics attached to a physical mixer, and it gets you a better sound. It's a warmer sound, it's a cleaner sound. There are lots of different condenser microphones out there, but finding a condenser microphone which is on a stand or a boom mic, which you can see in this picture, will lift the microphone off the table, so you don't get any noise in the background, the rustling noises. So a boom mic is actually the top thing I find, and the stand is the next thing, as 2 microphone options. So condenser mics that we use personally is the Rode Pod mic, which was launched last year, and it has a beautiful sound. It's warm. It's a lovely mic to use. It's light. It's lighter than the other mics, but it feels sturdy and it feels like a good mic to record with. It sits around the €150 mark to buy, so it's relatively affordable. It's not cheap, and it's not too expensive. There are great other microphones to buy, which are much, much more expensive. The Rode Podcaster was the original mic that Rode created. Rode is a company from Australia. It's a great audio company. The Rode Podcaster, a lot of professional podcasters use, and it has pretty much the same sound as a pod mic, maybe a tiny bit better, but it is pretty much the same. If you're working more on online, like as we are right now, interviews with people, so if you're using, if you'd like to remote call people, USB mic is a better option, because if you're using a condenser mic, you're probably better to use a condenser mic in a room with 1, 2, or 3 people. And so using a USB microphone is a good thing for online interviews. The ATR 2100 is my top pick. I have that microphone. I have the Rode Pod mic, as I just mentioned. Timothy Ferris, which I'm sure most of you know, he's a top podcaster. He has the ATR 2100. He sends the ATR 2100 over to every single guest he interviews. He sends them buys the ATR 2100, sends it to them to get a really good sound, but he has the cash to do so. But the 2100 is a really good sounding microphone. You can actually listen to how it sounds. Right now, Tanya and I are recording remotely, so she's using our 2100, and you can listen to the quality of sound on our podcast. So the last 3 episodes have the 2100 to kind of check the quality of sound. There are also many other good microphones you can use. We also have another one. It's called a Blue microphone. It's actually this microphone here in the picture. And you can do lots of different things with this microphone. You can use it within a group. You can use it solo. There's lots of options you can do. So play around with the right microphone, which is right for you. But the most important thing is to get a good microphone that sounds good. The ATR 2100 sits around 75 to 80 euros to purchase. So it's not too expensive, and it's under 100 euros. It's a top quality sounding microphone. So moving on to the next part, that is your mixer. So you can either mix online. If you are recording directly online, you can use tools like Zencastr. I'm going to mention that in the next slide. There are lots of other tools you can record online. A great podcast that uses purely an online mixer is called The Squiz. I was going to mention another Australian podcast. It's a news recommendations podcast. It uses purely an online mixer, so it doesn't change the quality of sound at all. When we went down looking for mixers, we went down the massive rabbit hole of buying a mixer that looks like this. And I thought to myself, how the heck am I going to learn how to use that? Like, there's so many knobs and so many buttons. And yeah, I might have a bit of background in music, but I don't know how to use that thing. And I don't know how to mix anybody. And if you're on the fly and you're interviewing somebody, you're going to need to know how to use that mixer quick and fast. And you need to know what your presets are. So the top recommendation we could recommend for a mixer is the Zoom H6. We use it ourselves. A lot of podcasts that we know use the Zoom H6 themselves. It is awesome. There are many options. Zoom, the company, is top. It sits around €300 to buy a mixer like that. There are cheaper options. So there are options which are 4-channel, which means there are 4 microphones going in, that sit around the €80 to €90 mark on Amazon. Just Google mixer and you'll find mixers like this. What's important to think about when selecting a mixer is how many people are going to have on your podcast. Are you going to have just yourself? Then you really just need 1 channel. Yeah. So looking for a mixer that just has 1 channel. If it's you and your co-host and a guest, you're going to have 4 channels. If it's you, your co-host, and maybe 2 guests, you're probably looking at 6 channels. So it can get quite complicated and it can get quite technical. But the best thing is to keep it stupid simple. Find something which is easy to work with, simple knobs, simple buttons, on, off, and that's the best way to start. And of course, once you go down the journey of creating a podcast, then you start to know how to refine your sound via your mixer. And there's so many other features you can tap into. So recording, there's great ways you can do it. You can go directly into GarageBand, into Adobe Audition, or your own mixer yourself. You can also use a remote recorder like Zencastr, which I mentioned. Tanya and I are now using Zencastr purely. It's an awesome thing. You can have lots of different people on your episode. It's actually currently free at this point. Zencastr is free at this point. Adobe Audition does cost money. It costs about €200 a month. €200 a year. GarageBand is free and your mixer is free. So you can look at what is the best option for you. But if you are recording just by yourself, use something that you can either record directly into your mixer or record directly into Adobe Audition, GarageBand, or another option. If you're recording with somebody remotely, it's great to use an online mixer like Zencastr or others. If you'd like to know more about that specific topic, we can go further into that by email if you wish to find out more about remote recording. So moving on to post-production. This is a huge world of information, but post-production, there are a gamut of videos on YouTube to learn how to really edit audio. The most important thing is to listen for the pops, the hisses, the extra ums and ahs, because when you're listening to one podcast all the way through, if it's a flowing conversation, it's great. But if you hear, someone's going to switch off because they don't have the bandwidth to listen to those things. So great thing, post-production, you're in control of that stuff. I can definitely say I throw out a huge amount of ums and ahs when I'm recording, and I cut those things out. Toot sweet. So great editing apps are Audacity, free. GarageBand, free if you've got an Apple computer. Adobe Audition, my top pick. We're using it ourselves. Adobe Audition, we went with it because it was easier to work with. It had more functionality. We could add in music tracks. We could add in sound effects. It was just easier and visual, and we went with that option just due to simplicity. It does take some time to onboard yourself onto a tool like that. Learning any tool, learning WordPress, learning PowerPoint, learning how to do a great Excel. All these tools take time to learn, but once you put in the time and you really master the tool, then you're flowing, then you're going. Hosting. So this is the next part of post-production. So once you create your episode, you're going to need to write some show notes for your episode. So summarizing what that episode was all about. Top things, keep it simple, keep it short, 4 paragraphs, 5 paragraphs, short. The top things that the person was going to learn in the episode, what were the key takeaways from the episode, where can they listen, where can they find out more information. You might have a newsletter you'd like them to sign up to, a little bit about you guys or yourself, what's your background, the top 1 or 2 things, why you're great to listen to, why they should listen to you. And when you start hosting, pop it on a program like LipSync, Whooshkaa, another great Australian program. It's actually currently free under 5,000 listeners a month, I think. And then it goes up €29 a month once you hit 10,000 listeners a month. So the more listeners you get, the more it costs, which is a good problem to have. And then moving on to your launch. This is a huge topic. It's we could do a whole meetup on just the launch of a podcast. But 3 key takeaways is record your 3 pillar episodes. This is super important because especially Apple, they really encourage people to listen to episode after episode. So, on Apple or whatever podcast app you're on, it'll normally flow onto the next episode. So with your pillar episodes, which is kind of your foundation of your podcast, it kind of creates the legs of your podcast. It's your first impression. So what do people want to listen to immediately? What are you going to give them? What kind of value? Give them a bit of a variety of what you're going to sound like. Pillar episodes are great to reference back to in future episodes. So once you keep recording more episodes, you can refer back to that pillar episode and keep getting people to play back to those older episodes. A great thing about pillar episodes is it does help your rankings. So people can go back and download past episodes with pillar episodes. And as I mentioned, it's great for consuming multiple episodes in one go. The next thing which is connected to this is tease your launch. So, tease your launch on your socials. Maybe you create a contest for this. It's really important to get people to go to your podcast, download your first 3 episodes, subscribe, leave a review, and show that iTunes is, or wherever you're getting a podcast. But it's really good to focus on iTunes to start off with, because it really helps your ranking. As I say in the next point here, which is generate buzz, you're only new and noteworthy for 8 weeks. So really try and make the best you can in the first 8 weeks. And by doing this, by having those three pillar episodes and really generating that buzz, it'll help boost your ratings at the start. Try and get people to leave a review. If it's also on your socials, really encourage people to leave a review, screenshot it, and give something away that you can give some value that you can. And once you actually have that podcast out and you start rolling, create a distribution schedule. Okay, what's up next? So your first 3 episodes are out. What's up next? What's the next episode you're going to put out? What are the next 10 episodes? What's the next 20 episodes? Of course, those episodes will change with the times. So with COVID-19, most podcast schedules have gone out the window and they've tweaked their content, or they've changed their content to fit for COVID-19, because people don't want to hear so much information about other things, but it should be related to their lives at this point. But saying that, it's important to keep your podcast episodes evergreen. It's if that's the direction you're going. If it's a news podcast, of course it's changing. If it's a storytelling podcast, of course it's changing. But if we're focusing on business or a podcast to really push your business or your brand, your company, evergreen content is awesome. So to wrap this up, I'm sure you have some questions and I'm happy to jump into them. Please do subscribe to our monthly newsletter. We do talk about lots of different things in that newsletter, and we have heaps of hacks, tips, and resources that will help you get growing. It's www.growgetterspodcast.com/newsletter. We have our next newsletter going out tomorrow, and it's not a spammy email. It's just simple information and tools and tips. So thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to find out more, please email us at growgetterspodcast@gmail.com, or check us out at growgetterspodcast.com/podcast, which you'll find all of the episodes. We have all of our episodes online on podcast. So I will just flip over to the chat. Just hold on one second. Okay, so I'm going to try and keep within the time frame as much as possible. But if I can't answer some of these questions, I'm really happy to answer them in a follow-up, however we do it. I'll talk to Charlotte how we do it. So if you have any questions, please write them in the chat now. I'm going to start with the first question I see, which is from Holger. And his question is, what's your view on social media and which one works the best for you? So the best channel that we have is LinkedIn. LinkedIn is really, because of our audience, LinkedIn is the best channel for us. We're a business podcast. We're targeting women. We're targeting career ladies. We're targeting side hustlers. We're targeting lady entrepreneurs. So LinkedIn is a really great place to be, and a lot of people that are in that space have a LinkedIn profile. So with LinkedIn, we try and keep not too much content going. Like, we try not to spam LinkedIn. We try and keep it easy on content, but it works super well for us. The second channel for us equally is Facebook and Instagram. Because of the lady startup style or entrepreneur focus, we get a lot of followers or a lot of kind of momentum from social media, from Instagram. We have a 6-time weekly schedule for social media. So we post 6 times a week, and we try and keep stories happening every single day. The key to using a social channel is consistency. So whatever you decide to do, consistency is key. So just keeping that consistent flow of content in a similar style every week, every month, every day, however you do it, but make sure it's not overwhelming and not overbearing for you. So if you can't keep up with that, tailor it down, cut it down, make it once a week. Make it every fortnight. However it works for you. Try not to be overburdened by the work that goes into social media. The second thing about social media, that's the push, but it's also the hustle. So asking your followers to follow you back, to like your podcast or review your podcast, asking people or leaving valuable comments on other people's podcasts or on other people's channels is really important. Having a conversation with people that people follow you is also really important. So showing that you are a person behind the podcast is also really important. Okay, so Sharik says, I'm just doing daily live videos on Facebook, but how to make it commercial or get money? I have guests from all over the world, mostly US. That's awesome. That's really awesome. Well, to do this daily video, you might think about co-advertising. You might think about shifting the model. There are many ways that you can monetize this. You might think about actually offering something at the end of your videos. You might have something tangible to offer as an offering. I'm sure that there is a lot of ways you can monetize or make it commercial. So maybe think about the current model that you have. If the insights that you're actually extracting on these videos are so tangible and interesting enough, you might want to create a program out of them, or create an offering of some sort with the people or the guests that you interview. You might want to record them and put them behind a paywall. There's lots of ways that you could commercialize it. Holger said, again, in your view, is there a certain time before it doesn't make sense to have ads on it? It's a really good question. I think really from my perspective and from my view, it comes down to the number of followers or number of downloads or number of subscribers you have. So it makes sense. Yeah, I think it's good to start off with no ads. I think it's good to start off with no advertisers, or even if you don't have to go that direction, even better, because it's about listening experience, and it's about gathering people and bringing them along the journey. And sometimes listening to an ad is quite annoying. But if you have to, if it makes sense, if that's the way to commercialize and you'd like to go more full-time into your podcast, then bringing on related subscribers or advertisers is something that makes sense. If it adds value to your audience, then that's should be okay. Depending on your relationship with your audience is the most important thing, and what you need to do. If you need to go down the advertising route and you have enough downloads, then it's a good thing to consider. Do I have examples of successful Adlib podcasts? I can find some. I'll find some. Let me find some. That's a good challenge. Playful Paula if you had a small team to collaborate with, how would you divide different tasks and responsibilities? That's an awesome idea. That's a really good point. Well, we do have a small team. We have someone else coming on our podcast who's going to help us with partnerships and with our social media and lots of other things. So we do have a mini team now. Woohoo! So how we're going to divide our tasks up is I'm going to do what I'm more suited to do, which is the post-production, the sound, and Tanya's focus much more on social media. We develop scripts equally, and that's how we divide up our tasks in general. But it's really important to focus on your strengths. What is your strength? Are you better with music? Are you better with sound? Are you better with visuals? Are you better with writing? Or can you equally do that? Are you better on social media? Do you like it? Does your other co-host like it? So it's important to find where you naturally feel good and follow that. Yeah, I think it's an awesome question. Thanks for that question. StreamYard.com can be really good live streaming, recording available on paid version. Kate Sharik just mentioned that to the group. Okay, hold on a second. How do I do that? I'm going to try and make Charlotte the host again. Sorry, everybody. I am going to try and figure out how this works. Okay, I'm going to participants, Charlotte, make host. Okay. There you go.
Oh, thank you. Because I wasn't able to help you with the questions.
No worries. Thank you. Okay.
I think Clara also asked about Adlib, examples of Adlib podcasts.
Yeah, I just mentioned that a second ago. I can't think of any from the top of my head, but I do know. Okay, I can definitely say there's one podcast that's pretty Adlib. It's called Shameless. It's a Aussie podcast. Once again, I listen to a lot of Aussie content, and it's a great podcast. And the ladies do Adlib a lot, so of course they have a good basis of what they're going to talk about. They've got a good framework, which is not so much an outline. You know, I think it's the kind of building blocks. You've got to have a bit of a building block of what you're going to talk about, but they ad-lib a lot. They chit chat a lot. There's a lot of discussion. So that's a great example that comes to mind, but I'm sure that there are many others and I can find them. It's a challenge.
And I think there's a question about how to validate my podcast concept from Azar.
Okay. Well, I think we can actually both talk about that, Charlotte. But with validating an idea, it comes down to is there an audience for this? I think there are many ways that you could validate it. You could actually do a prototype podcast, so you could launch it. A great example of that is a good friend of mine, Kelty. She just launched a podcast called the Clarity Podcast. Only a couple of weeks ago, and she created a prototype podcast, one episode, recorded on her iPhone, and then she put it online. She asked her audience to listen to it and see if it was interesting, and then she had such a swell of interested people. She thought, okay, well, people want to listen to this. Let's give it another go. I'm going to launch the actual podcast. So it was a great way to kick off the podcast and to actually test if people really want to listen to it or not. So if you have an existing audience, it's a great thing to test an idea if people want to continue listening or if they'd like to know more about this concept of yours.
Great. And the next question is, do we wait for advertisers to reach out or should we be the one doing the cold calling?
I think that's a really good question. I think it comes down to your audience. How big is your podcast? How many subscribers, how many downloads do you have? at the end of the day, really people will knock on you. It's better for you to knock on people's doors than to go the other way, because you could be waiting for decades. So the most important thing is to do the hustling yourself. You know, if you love your product and you love your podcast, get it out there, share it with people. If you genuinely put your heart into it, find people that will find advertisers that are aligned with your brand and do the knocking. If you have a huge podcast already, then yeah, definitely make connections, network with people, and then they might do the asking. But it's always better to do the asking yourself if that's what you need and that's what you'd like to do with your podcast.
Mm-hmm. And last question I'm seeing is from Mustika, and they asked, should we start building our brand in social media first or directly jump in making a podcast?
That's a really, really, really good question. I think ideally better to have an audience to launch to. Sometimes if you launch a podcast with nothing, then you're basically in your own echo chamber. But sometimes you don't have the audience to do so, and you just want to get it out there. You want to build as you grow. So you can kind of take a both and approach. Build and prep and launch. That would be one way to go with it if you don't have an audience already. So yeah, always good to have an audience. If you have an audience already, awesome. If you have the flexibility to build an audience before you launch a podcast, then that's a great thing to do, because then you've got more people to get people to review your podcast, to get people to download your podcast, subscribe and share it. But as I mentioned, if you don't have the flexibility to do so, yeah, I would definitely recommend to build social, prep, podcast, launch.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't see other questions. Did I miss anything? No. All right. So maybe let me just repeat again. If you're new, I just dropped a link to the meetup. Please join us because we'll have more events coming up. We're always looking for speakers. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us as well. And thank you so much for your time, everyone. And thank you very, very much, Tiffany. That was awesome. Really, really great content. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, everybody. It was really a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to speak to you all today. And thanks again, Charlotte.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too, guys. Ciao.
Bye.